Hi, can you hear me? Thanks for having me. I'm a little bit jet lagged, so hopefully the right words come out in the right order, but we'll see. So the name of my slideshow is Reli-Geo-Engineering, but I'll just jump right in. So to start off, a little bit about, is this working? Oh yeah, okay. So a little bit about my background. I was born in Berlin, in West Berlin, in '84. This is me and my grandma in front of the wall. And my dad is ethnic Mongolian-Chinese, and my mom is German. And this is me and my grandma also at Tiananmen Square in '88, and my cousin. And then when I was 8, my mom remarried and we moved to the United States. We moved to Arizona because my mom married an Apache Native American who was my stepdad. And in this time, I grew up sort of in this Native American culture, and we were on this ceremonial circuit. We went to different powwows and different ceremonies, different dances. And this is actually a picture from our backyard. We had a sweat lodge in our backyard. This is a picture from the Apache crown dance, which is a really special ceremony. But growing up in Arizona, I was kind of growing up in two different cultures at the same time. There's the Native American culture and the larger white American culture. And there was something, very particularly contrasting about them. They're almost complete opposites, but one thing in particular was how they dealt with nature. And in Native American culture, nature is sort of at the center of their culture and spirituality. And on the other hand, especially in the Western United States, you have a lot of evangelical fundamentalist Christianity. Also, of course, in Mongolian culture, Mongolian Tengurism, it's very similar in many ways to Native American culture, and that's something that I was also exposed to. So, growing up in these different cultures, it made me really try to think about why is it that the Western relationship is so unique, and why is it that the Western, you could even say that the Western world or Western culture is at war with nature. I really like this quote from this indigenous scholar, Frederick Martin. Europeans are the only people on the face of the earth who hate nature enough to advocate its total destruction. Native Americans don't do that. So, indigenous people, they comprise less than 5% of the global population, but they actually protect 80% of the biodiversity. And so, it leads to this idea that, the deep problem of the environmental crisis is primarily a cultural problem. Here you can see, total emissions for climate change, historical emissions, and America and Europe, of course, are much larger than anyone else. So, why is this relationship to nature so unique? I made this little meme. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. I hate when people say white people have no culture, like, try again, sweetie. It's a kind of a popular meme, but here's a picture of Bonifatius as he's chopping down the Donau Asche in Fulda as he's Christianizing the Germanic tribes. So I think what makes the European cognition so unique, of course, there's many layers to it. I think that, and I'll examine a few of them, but I think partly what leads to it are, for example, the Proto-Indo-European androcratic, male-dominated military caste culture, an agro-logistic extractivism, some Judaic monotheism, and Greek anti-materialism, just to name a few. But if you look at this framework of culture as an adaptation and adaptations to ancestral environments, and you look back at the differences between foraging cultures and sedentary agrarian cultures, you can recognize some common differences. So in agricultural societies, farming led to the private ownership of nature, food surplus led to class stratification, domesticated animals likely led to gender stratification, human-centered, and they tended to have human-centered religions, which were engaging in political power and land power. And on the other hand, foraging cultures, small group sizes meant that they tend to be more egalitarian, they tend to be more gender balanced, and they tend to be ecologically aware with nature-oriented religions that hold reciprocity with nature at the center of their culture. So if you think about religion specifically as a mechanism to shape culture, you can think about religion as a social technology, and that they are a kind of adaptive meaning system that produce adaptive behavior, specifically at the scale of the group. And they do things like align goals, values, beliefs. For group survival, there's always this kind of tension between the individual and the group. They also serve functions like regulating forgiveness, who to forgive for what. And the individuals get benefits like a social network, for example. There's this there's this evolutionary biologist, David Sloan Wilson, who writes about the evolution of religion, and he kind of cites this example of early Christianity being a mutation of Judaic religion, in that for the first time, it mutated and it opened the door to Gentiles, and it gave access to non-Jews to this extended social network, to this very tight social network, which had adaptive advantage. So, you can think of religions as sort of harnessing spiritual emotionality and communal emotionality to kind of drive this engine. Here's a quote from David Sloan Wilson: "Religions exist primarily for people to achieve together what they cannot achieve alone." And it gets a bit technical also. It's kind of coming from this framework of multilevel selection theory, which basically says that selection happens at all scales of organisms, from the genes, the cell, the organ, the organism, small groups, societies, etc., and all the way up to the planet. And religions are sort of features at the group scale. But yeah, I'll just kind of skip through that. So there's also, this Greek anti-materialism and dualism that kind of got mixed up into the pot, and it kind of resulted in this European Abrahamic bias against matter and materiality. In the Bible, matter is sort of depicted as inert and lifeless and without form, and it's only through, an act of God that form and life is given. And this, of course, results in this anthropodualism, which a lot of the other speakers have already touched upon, and some of this stuff I'm kind of repeating. But the dualisms between nature versus culture, biology versus technology, etc. Another expression of this is the metaphor of nature as a machine, this lifeless sort of thing that you can just tinker with. But actually, matter is innately dynamic, it's irreducible, emergent, it's self-organizing, it's contingent, and it's alive, and it's sacred. But this dualism is, it's so deeply baked into Western language and value system. The term being materialistic is a pejorative, it's a bad thing. And I think that the roots of that goes back to Christianity and this idea of being in the world but not of the world, that your soul is kind of separate from the sin, the original sin of the world, of the material world. This is a picture I took in Santa Rosa in 2017 after one of these first mega fires that happened a few years ago. So climate change, is a changing environment now, and you can make the argument that these what I would call plantation religions are maladapted for our contemporary environment and world. Trump and Bolsonaro being perfect examples. So, and there's different expressions of this problem. There's the acute political problem, which you find more in the United States, or Latin America, or Eastern Europe even. But then there's the deeper and more subtle cultural problem. Even in critical theory, we're sort of from having this sort of dualistic, anthropocentric frame of mind, the subject versus object dualism, which comes, to us via psychoanalysis and phenomenology, which has a history of privileging human narratives, discourses, languages, signs. There's a sort of an anti-spectacle component to it, which really affects art, I think, in critical art. There's, a strain of anti-evolution, anti-sociobiology. There's also an eroded trust in science, and I just put an early Latour there. And then, the whole thing can has been summed up with this catch-all term of correlationism, that everything is always correlated through the human subjectivity. But now, of course, there are these new strains in philosophy that are trying to sort of, amend this, and they're quite different, the different strains, but they all generally share this idea of a flat ontology, that humans are just one organism amongst a whole community of organisms. And I would make the argument, and actually the reason that I was attracted to reading New Materialism, for example, is, looking back, that there was a lot of overlap and connection with indigenous cosmology and indigenous understanding of the world. So they already operate from an inherent flat ontology. Of course, they've known and warned against ecological destruction for a very long time. They think of the world as made of relatives rather than resources, and the material world is sacred. So, the reason that we had a sweat lodge in our yard was, and sweat lodge is a Lakota ceremony, actually, but since the 70s and the American Indian Civil Rights Movement, which was basically started by this organization called AIM, there was sort of an outsized influence of Lakota. And so today, a lot of non-Lakota and sort of practice Lakota religion, and it's kind of become the basis of this sort of pan-Native American religion. But Lakota, in Lakota, the main, there's this term that you say at the end of a prayer. It's kind of like Ammon, which is mitakeyasin, but not only is it like Ammon, it's actually the very center of their religion, the very central concept, just like Jesus would be for Christianity. But mitakeyasin translates to all my religion. At the very core of their religion and spirituality is this idea that we're all related to everything, and it's not just, of course, animals and plants, but we're related to the stones, we're related to the wind, etc. So, where does that leave us? I think, I think issues of indigenous sovereignty are very critical, and they're not just critical for indigenous people, but they're critical for all of us. They're really at the front lines of trying to protect everyone. Here's an example of, this is 56 indigenous human rights and nature defenders murdered in 2020 alone, and in the year before that was over 200. So this is an ongoing war that's happening. So where does that leave us, though? In a Western global society, let me just go back, actually. There's this indigenous activist. She has this quote: "You forced your civilization upon us, and now look where we are. Global pandemic crisis, species extinction, and driving it all, widespread spiritual poverty." So they've always, there's this history of identifying that there's a spiritual problem, and not recognizing the spiritual reality of other beings. And so what do we do? And I think really, what we need is a new meaning system, a new adaptive meaning system that we can use to adapt to this changing world and environment. And we need a spirituality of symbiosis. So if you think about religions as technologies of social coordination, then how do we harness that? How do we harness that towards surviving? And as an artist, I think that perhaps contemporary art, or art in general, in an expanded term, is maybe already forming the basis for this kind of spirituality. Art, especially contemporary art, defines a moral community. It's kind of synchronizing morality in many ways. We engage in rituals like this, for example, or exhibitions. We have our places of worship. And at its best, it creates spiritual emotion as well, and it's driven by the same kind of spiritual emotionality. And also at its best, it celebrates difference and diversity, which I think is a really important value to have today. So my project as an artist is trying to sketch something out, trying to articulate something like this. So my meta project that I've been working on for a few years is called New Peace. And I like to think of New Peace as it's an articulation of a new materialist spirituality, a kind of neo-pantheism. It's a rejection of old dualisms, and it uses media, branding, imagery, and as tools of cognitive access. And I could get into that more, but basically, I think that that's the tool set that you have when you regard the human as an animal, a materialist model of the animal. And potentially, hopefully, this could be at least a suggestion of a memetic machine that could address climate change. And so I see it as a kind of a political project. I tried to think of some ways of, how do we access spiritual emotions today in a secular, post-secular world. And so I kind of, am kind of sketching out or identifying possible sources and possible sort of axes to define the project. The first one I'm calling the undivided ground, which is basically just, the concept of an ontological whole that rejects the dualisms, like I was mentioning. And the second one I'm calling faith in pattern, which is basically coming from the concept of emergence, and specifically thinking about how we could retool the idea of faith, and how we could base it in the concept of morphogenesis. The idea that matter is sort of self-forming itself into these divinely aesthetic patterns at all scales of reality. From the smallest grain of sand to the largest galaxy, there's this beautiful patterning happening. And so, for myself, in my own feelings of spirituality, especially, spending time in nature, you really, one is really struck by the patterning and the overwhelming beauty of the patterns. And I always, had the sense that, this patterning is so pervasive that no matter what happens in my life or in anyone's life, one is still a part of that pattern. One is still a part of this really beautiful pattern. The third concept I'm calling prey to scale, which is basically this idea of a higher power, or connecting to a higher power. And that, there's this, recognizing that there's this inherent wellspring of spiritual emotion just from the simple contemplation of scale itself. Just thinking about, the time it took the light of the stars to travel across the galaxies and hit your eyes, or, the depth of time, the vastness of space. And I think anybody who really contemplates that, or most people have had those experiences of contemplating that and feeling a sense of spirituality. The last one I'm calling purpose from difference, which is basically drawing on contingency and the idea of contingency, and recognizing that there's this fundamental process of differentiation that the universe is engaging in. That, we started with a mass of hydrogen and helium, and then over time this has progressively differentiated into all the diversity that we have today, and all the beings and conferences and plants and everything else. And so it makes me think maybe it's difference itself that's the real value of life. And there's some kind of interesting analogs in AI research and other stuff, but I'm not going to get into that. But I also think that this is potentially a way of, moving forward into a post-human ethics. Recognizing that value comes from diversity, and not just from humanity. And of course that, builds in the value of biodiversity and cultural diversity. So here's just examples of my works. And these, I see these as sort of artifacts of New Peace, worship sites and altars, etc. These are actually some trees that I scanned in the same fire in California in 2017. And I had them cast in aluminum. This is in New York. There's another version in Beijing. This is a sculpture. I have this series of sculptures of 3D scanning trees. This is a a tree that was actually in Georgia O'Keeffe's farm or ranch in New Mexico. This is shown in China. Again, I'm using a lot of kind of marketing aesthetics and marketing imagery, which I think of as the way to sort of access attention, really. This is a show I did at Beijing. Here's an example of what I would call a call to action, or a new materialist call to action, which is commit to a world outside yourself. Commit to the idea that you're not just that there's no other subjectivities outside of your own subjectivity. And I also do a lot of nature renderings, 3D renderings. So these are all rendered, of course, and the rendering process for me is a kind of devotional process of, really looking in detail at nature, and it's almost in a meditative way that you zoom into reality. And there's a kind of an ecosystem of websites and branding around it. Faith in morphogenesis, alive for difference. This is a VR piece that I made. This is my last show in DC last fall, and this was a tree that I scanned in Peru, in the Amazon, actually during a ayahuasca dieta, and I just mentioned that because I think psychedelics are actually a very important part of this. Sorry, I included a lot of slides. This is a picture of the actual tree. It's much bigger, of course. And and this is a prayer that kind of came to me in that same journey. And this is the last slide, actually, so I'll leave you guys with this. Thank you.